So we're a piece of hardware, we connect to the electrolyzer, and we're querying it using electrical pulses. So we're injecting these pulses, they don't disrupt operations, but they're querying or asking the electrolyzer, what's going on? Can you tell me about your behavior? And the electrolyzer comes back and essentially gives information about critical indicators of performance in real time. And that's, very simply what we do.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the CleanTechies Podcast. This is episode 54 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Maynor, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to bring this show to you, and I'm very thankful for you for tuning in. Before we get into the details of today's episode, our ask of you is to please be sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us know any questions you'd like us to ask in future episodes or future topics you'd like us to discuss. We also want to highlight our offer to you. If you are a founder with specific needs, we're glad to help make any intros that we can. This could be intros to capital, partnership opportunities, talent, etc. Generally speaking, my goal is to help all climate tech founders in any way I can. So definitely reach out, and glad to connect in that way. All right, let's get into today's episode details. Today our episode is with Mariam Awara. Maryam is the COO at Pulsenics Inc., which is a Canada-based IoT device company that is helping enable electrochemistry at scale. And today our conversation largely focuses and kind of revolves around how they're helping significantly reduce the costs of creating green hydrogen. So we dive into existing problems, how their tech works, and how they are solving those problems. To give you a precursor in general, in the event if you're not a big fan of science, I'm just kind of trying to dumb it down a little bit. They basically have a device that helps monitor the internals of very expensive and hard to develop machinery such as electrolyzers to identify when issues are starting so that they can be fixed before a large breakdown. The same way kind of like preventative health helps avoid major health crises. So it's really exciting to see what they're doing in general. I think it's very interesting. Their business model as well solves more than just the green hydrogen market, meaning they can stick around even if it takes a while for green hydrogen to take off. So very interesting in general. But of course, before we get into the show, we would like to thank our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, ESG, and technology spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change, please do consider reaching out to them at next-wavepartners.com, or you can reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page, and they will help you from there. So without any further delay, let's get into the show. All right, welcome to the show, Maryam. How are you doing today?
Doing well. How are you, Silas?
I'm fine as frog hair, as my dad would say. A saying that I picked up growing up. I kind of like it. A lot of people find it interesting, but I'm doing well. I'm really excited for this conversation today. I think the technology you guys are working on is super fascinating. So let's jump right into things. Can you start by just kind of giving us a quick introduction to yourself and to what you're doing?
Yes, I'm Maryam. I'm one of the co-founders at Pulsenics. I have research experience in power systems, wireless telecommunications. What I studied in school is electrical and computer engineering at the University of Calgary. What we do at Pulsenics is very simple. What we do is essentially manage the efficiencies of clean energy processes so that they're reliable and economical.
Okay. And so how did you, before we get into kind of deeply into what Pulsenics is doing, how did you end up getting into climate in general? What motivated you to make this change and to build your career here?
So actually, I watched a YouTube video in grade 11. I was a nerd just watching YouTube videos of maglev trains, and I stumbled upon a video about a researcher that had invented a new way to capture sunlight so that solar panels are more efficient. And that stuck with me. It was really interesting to me, and I was very curious about it. At the time, I was just thinking, I was not thinking about engineering whatsoever. I had no clue what engineering was or what I could do with engineering. But I wanted to work with renewables or with EVs or with maglev trains. I was obsessed with it. So did a little bit of research, figured out it was electrical engineering that I needed to really take and start to understand the concepts of. Did a computer engineering minor so that I can understand the data and software side of things. But really, that was always my goal. So when I graduated university, I moved to Toronto to be part of an entrepreneurship program here called Next Canada. And that's where I met the founding team of Pulsenics. The CEO, Assam, he was wrapping up his PhD in optimization techniques for electrochemical systems. So that's the systems that are kind of at the heart of the clean energy transition. And we've been in touch and essentially started working together on commercializing that piece of technology or invention before any policies came into play about clean energy processes or the transition to low carbon economy. And so it kind of transitioned into that, but it was the idea of the core technology and the idea of using that core technology to treat water at the time. That's what our focus was. That's how I got into the climate tech space.
Interesting. So I'm always curious when there's a lot of people who have founded companies kind of through meeting people early on in their days of their career, and then somebody's coming right out of university, a lot of times in climate from a PhD program.
Yes.
How did it kind of evolve from discussions of his technology then to eventually kind of turning it into something, right? What did it look like at its very early stage? And then walk us through the processes that happened in order to take this off the ground and actually make it a full-time kind of endeavor for everybody involved.
Yeah, so actually when it started out, the idea was, can we treat water in a cleaner way? And so the idea was to develop a reactor or a system that would take in electricity and be able to take in electricity and dirty water, and chemical reactions would happen inside of the system, and then you'd get clean water. But this sort of system, in general, taking in electricity in order to induce chemical reactions, this type of process in industry is extremely expensive because it's not used en masse. It's not massively adopted. And so the idea there was, how can we actually make it so that there's cost parity when it comes to treating water, really dirty water, instead of using chemical or biological ways that could be environmentally non-friendly, that we can make it economical to treat water in an environmentally friendly way. So actually, born out of that was the core technology that we're now commercializing at Pulsenics. We spent 2 years building water treatment systems. And we had this core technology that essentially added visibility into what the behavior of that system was doing. And using that data, we were able to improve the energy use or energy consumption and make it more economical. But the turning point from that idea to Pulsenics was when policies started to shift. And we started to actually get companies who are developing other water treatment systems or systems to split water to produce hydrogen, or systems like batteries and energy storage, started to ask us if they can use our core technology with their systems. And that's when we realized visibility might actually be a value proposition in and of itself for these sorts of systems.
Mm-hmm. So most of the technology was basically, it was very easy to transition over to a newer kind of a different specific application, correct?
Yes and no. So yes, in the sense that we understood the value of it because we had used it for our own purposes. We knew that it could happen. So the invention and the theory was there. But developing it as a standalone product that met the market requirements for all these other types of systems, and then scaling up the technology so that it can be used for an industrial scale system, is where I think it was about 18 months of development was focused on just on that.
Mm-hmm. And then, so I guess I'm really curious, especially with physical, devices like this. What did the process look like? Did you find somebody who would just say, listen, you can test this on our facility? Did you test it on a small scale? How did this work? Maybe the mechanics of it as the kind of operations person. How did this all work and play out as you were testing these things? Are there specialty manufacturers that help with kind of building these initial things? I'm just really curious on the funding and the whole mechanism to make this happen.
So there were a few things. The first is with any new technology, especially physical technology, you need to be able to prove out the concept, but also that it will add a big delta in terms of value. And so because we had used this technology on our own systems, and these systems were deployed with mines that wanted to treat water, we had that sort of data. We had the data that said, if you can track what's happening inside of a system that takes in electricity for production, then you're going to get big deltas in terms of your bottom line. So that was step one. But step two is then trying to figure out if there's a product market fit outside of your own application or use case. For that requires exactly what you said. The first two companies that we talked to that said, come on site, come to our industrial facility and connect your hardware and let's see how it works. And if it works well, then you've got us as your clients. So that's a demonstration of market pull. Beyond that, you really need networks in terms of supply chain and manufacturing, iterating really fast. And for us, we found that sort of community and network through a program called the HACS program. It's a manufacturing accelerator. It's backed by SOSV VC. And the whole premise is they've got facilities in Shenzhen, China, and they've got presence in SF. So the whole idea is if you've got a hardware product, you want to iterate fast so that you can figure out what works and what doesn't. So we went through that program in February 2020, and that's how we were able to iterate really, really fast without having to develop that overhead or the operations of how do we develop our supply chain and manufacturing network when we really did not have that experience to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fascinating because that's obviously a massive undertaking, right? That's why a lot of people, I think there's a lot of criticism right now about climate venture capital companies being unwilling to invest in hard tech, right? Because it is hard, no pun intended. But it's just, you can't just create it out of nothing, right? You need to have these networks, these existing, relationships with a lot of people. And it sounds like that HACS network HACS program was very, very useful. I've never heard of that. So that's interesting. So let's dive a little bit more into exactly the technology. So could you kind of give us the main industry you're working with and kind of what the problem is that you're solving, kind of take us through the rungs of how it's working and where in the value chain you're stepping in, and feel free to explain things along the way.
Okay, sounds good. So I will tell you that right now, if you wanted to deploy a process to produce hydrogen, for instance, without using fossil fuels, it will be extremely, extremely challenging for two main reasons. The first is the systems that will allow you to do that are not reliable. And the second is, as a result, it's extremely expensive to deploy. And so the way that you would do that is develop a reactor or a system that takes in electricity and water. This system that you've developed will then split the water into hydrogen and oxygen. And what you get as a result is hydrogen and oxygen. That's the clean energy process. That's the process where if you electrified your system, you would be able to produce hydrogen using electricity from renewables. And that's where low carbon hydrogen comes in. And if you decarbonize hydrogen, you're able to actually abate 37% of all energy related emissions, because hydrogen is a feedstock to many different processes, from transportation to chemicals to cement, steel, and so on. That's the main industry we're working with. And the reason is because this is an industry where there exists a strong need and a strong and urgent need to de-risk, to scale up, and to deploy. And it's backed by 32 different countries having national strategies specifically targeting being able to deploy gigawatt capacities of these sorts of systems. Two things come into play here. So of course, policies come into play, but the reason policies have been able to shift in that way is because renewables are getting cheaper. And so now it's becoming a reality that you can actually electrify processes that in the past you could only really economically produce using fossil fuels. But it still remains at least 6 times more expensive than a fossil fuel process and extremely unreliable. You can get shutdowns when you deploy the system that are unplanned, that can last for up to 6 months. And you have a lot of question marks. There's just a lot of unknowns about deploying these sorts of systems. And so you can imagine why it is not an attractive proposition really for a big energy company to be deploying gigawatt capacities of these systems, even if they will get subsidies from the government or so on and so forth. So where we fit into that ecosystem is twofold. The first is, in order for you to develop this system, it's called an electrochemical system. In order for you to develop this sort of system, you have to go through about 5 to 7 years of a development process. And the reason is because when you're developing these systems, you have no visibility into how your design choices translate to industrial performance. The only way you can kind of understand that is if you build the system and then run that system for about 30,000 hours minimum. And then you have to take that system offline in your lab, deconstruct it, and then go using lab-based tools, essentially perform analysis on each of the components in the system. Not ideal. Secondly, is once you've developed the system, you've spent your 5 to 7 years developing it, validating it, quality assuring it, manufacturing it. Then you're going to go out and deploy the system. But you're deploying it, you can face these unplanned shutdowns that we were talking about. Your system could just fail. And you don't know why, and you don't know how to stop it from failing, and you have no way to predict when it will fail. Secondly, is that once you've deployed it, you realize just how energy intensive it is. It's taking in a lot of electricity just to split that water to produce the hydrogen. And so efficiencies are subpar, and performance, stability, reliability, and economics are just not there. That's the big challenge that we're facing now when we're moving away or transitioning from fossil fuels to an electrified industry.
Mm-hmm. So maybe just a couple of things to maybe, first of all, I guess reiterate what you said, just to make sure I understand it correctly. Building these systems, right? Like what's the technical term for these systems that we're referring to? Is it electrolysis?
Yeah, it's an electrolyzer. Yeah.
Electrolyzer. So we're building these electrolyzers, and in order to truly test their, that they work, they have to be tested for a very long time, and then they're taken back and deconstructed. So the iteration time is very slow. And as anybody who works in tech knows, many iterations are required for the final product, right? So this is why it's taking so long, correct?
Exactly. It's a hardware. Think about it like a large hardware product where you can't iterate fast enough. Yeah.
Got it. And then, so on top of that, I was curious to understand, you mentioned that a lot of governments have clean hydrogen as part of their plan for kind of shifting off of fossil fuels. Could you maybe name some of those, and what are a lot of the targets for these in terms of years when they want to have this stuff deployed?
Yeah. So, I mean, the US is a prime example. The Department of Energy and the infrastructure bill, essentially the target is that by 2030 and by 2050, there are certain gigawatts of capacities that they want to have deployed in terms of producing hydrogen in a low carbon way using electrolysis. So electrolysis is really at the heart of these sort of targets to produce this low carbon hydrogen economy.
Got it. Okay. So that makes sense. So it is a very urgent need, and it's something, obviously, if it's going to take a long time, we need to get going quickly and solve the iteration problem. So now we've laid out the problem of what you're facing. Can you walk us through how Pulsenics is able to help solve this?
Exactly. So an electrolyzer is really complex. That's one thing to keep in mind. That's a fact and a reality. It's really complex because you have all these different components that are coming together just to receive electricity and some sort of input so that it can give you the chemical reactions you care for it to happen in order to give you your yield or your product. So much like a human, if I come to you and I say, "Hi, Silas, what's going on?" and I just tap you on the shoulder, you're not really going to move. I'm not really disrupting you. But if you have the ability to tell me, "Hey, what's going on inside right now is that my brain neurons are working in this way, my liver is acting in this way, my blood count is X," then you're giving me a picture of what's happening inside of your complex system in real time. And so imagine me doing that every 20 seconds. And that's exactly what we do, but for an electrolyzer. So we're a piece of hardware, we connect to the electrolyzer, and we're querying it using electrical pulses. So we're injecting these pulses, they don't disrupt operations, but they're querying or asking the electrolyzer, "What's going on? Can you tell me about your behavior?" And the electrolyzer comes back and essentially gives information about critical indicators of performance in real time. And that's, very simply what we do. But the second layer of what we do is not hardware related, it's actually software and data. Because once you have that data, if you tell me my blood count is X, I will have no frame of reference or way to use that sort of data, right? And so you really need a way or a framework or tools to be able to actually digest that sort of data in a way that's meaningful to inform your design decisions for those iteration processes, but also for when you've deployed your system and you're operating.
Mhm. Got it. Okay, so then what does the integration process look like for setting these up? Because I'm assuming this should be something that can be applied to existing plants, correct?
Yeah, so the same cable that will be taking in electricity from a power source is the same cable that we would connect on the line up. So Pulsenics hardware would just connect electrically using the same cable that goes from the power source to the electrolyzer. And then we just add on top of whatever power that the electrolyzer is already seeing, these pulses that don't disrupt operations but query information.
Mhm. So very easy installation process. How does this look from an economic standpoint in terms of, say I'm operating one of these machines and I install this, maybe it has certain cost. Usually, how quickly am I able to see results, and like what's the rate of return, I guess, on this investment?
Well, for a manufacturer of these sort of systems, for every one of these systems that are developed and produced, um, on average, what we've seen from clients and the feedback that we've gotten is that we essentially will save 2 full-time, highly qualified engineers' times over a year-long period. And so for every single one of these systems, that's how much benefit they're getting. On top of that, you're getting the benefit of being able to go to market faster, 30% faster to be specific. So for every single one of these systems that are sold and deployed, you're able to get revenues in a much faster way, and that's millions and millions of dollars. So 1 megawatt electrolyzer could be $500,000 to $1 million in terms of how much they cost. So
Mhm.
that's a big benefit to the OEM because it's a very strategic initiative for them to be able to go to market faster, have a competitive edge, and be able to actually deploy these systems much, much faster.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that obviously, if there are these mandates coming, that's going to be required. I'm kind of curious. I know probably the large focus is on electrolyzers, but what are the other industries or sectors that this could be applicable to, that this technology could be used to support as well?
So I want to point out that electrochemistry is a very it's been here for decades. It's been something that has been around for decades, and actually there are industries that exclusively will use electrochemistry for their processing. All the aluminum, most of the copper, most of the zinc, the gold, the silver that is available in the world today is produced using an electrochemical process. So same kind of thing, a system that takes in electricity and whatever input to produce that product for us. But there are emerging applications now of electrochemistry because of that move away from fossil fuels and a move away and towards electrification of industries using renewables. So these emerging applications include energy storage, batteries, fuel cells, both for utilities or for transportation. There's, of course, the application that we started out with, which is treating water in a clean way using electrochemistry. There is converting CO2, carbon dioxide, to useful products like ethanol. Those are some of the applications.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So it's definitely largely applicable to many spaces. I'd be curious to hear what are some of the, I guess, challenges or objections that a lot of companies have, if any, right? It sounds like it's pretty much a no-brainer.
No, there are a lot of objections to adoption. And the biggest one here is, well, it depends who you're speaking with, but let's start with the, the upstream, the manufacturer of these systems. The objections here really are, first off, are your measurements accurate? Is it actually telling me about the behavior of my system? And the biggest challenge here is that there is no baseline. There are no previous tools that have allowed you to gather that sort of data on an electrochemical system. And so how do you actually compare what you're measuring with the data that you're gathering and prove it to them that these are accurate measurements that are coming from your system? Once you've done that, the second question is, well, I don't know what this data means, or I don't know exactly how to optimally interpret this data. These are the two biggest obstacles really for adoption with a manufacturer.
So generally speaking, they're just not sure if they don't really have a way to validate if you're telling them correct truth, right? Because it's not like they're comparing it to something else. They're just saying, you're bringing us this new idea. How do we know it's right?
Yeah. So we've had to develop our own ways to essentially showcase these things.
Got it. Okay. Interesting. I'm curious that, once obviously, as you kind of scale this and this is rolled out across many industries, what do you see so far are the impending next bottlenecks on the space, right? Because imagine this becomes kind of second nature, any company is going to have this involved in their system. Do you see next challenges that will be kind of the next thing to overcome in order to really make this more effective, especially in terms of creating green hydrogen?
Yeah, I see two main ones. I'm sure there are more, but they may not be within my scope of vision. The first being is that if we really are going to be deploying 94 gigawatt capacity by 2050, so 94 gigawatts of energy will be needed to produce the sort of hydrogen capacity that we need to fuel our lives. Where is that electricity coming from? That's 94 gigawatts of extra electricity that need to become available for these processes. So the availability of renewable electricity, to be precise, is going to be, I think, one of the things that on a system level, we're going to need to figure out as a society and as a world. Secondly is, right now, standards, codes, benchmarks, they're still in the nascent phases of development. So as we're deploying these big industrial systems, how is policy going to either catch up or lead the shaping of this industry? And then how is the industry going to change as a result of these new standards or benchmarks that will come about?
What are some of the big regulatory items right now that kind of either restrict or enhance and help the industry? I'm kind of curious to see what's there, and if you have any comments on what might be coming, because obviously it is a new industry, and you mentioned it's nascent. So I'm curious if you have ideas as to what other spaces they'd model it after, or kind of maybe any new things coming to the pipeline.
Yeah, what I've heard is that we're seeing the same trends with the electrification of industry as we're seeing with renewables 10 years ago, where there were issues with the economics and there were issues with policies and so on and so forth. And now it's becoming so that renewables are getting cheaper and cheaper, and to a point where it's actually leading to more industries shifting, which is manufacturing, transportation, and so on. And so a lot of people talk about that the industry right now is going to be modeled based off of how renewables has shaped out, how the world of renewable electricity has shaped out. And I think it goes hand in hand, but I think that's, we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds. I know that I have mixed feelings, generally speaking, on the government involvement in these things, because sometimes it's good, sometimes they have, almost, I would say probably generally they have good intentions, but oftentimes there's negative side effects of their policies, right? And I think that maybe adopting a little bit more of a quicker response time to the market effects of their policies, they should iterate on their policies a little bit. Maybe they could take a page out of the book of startups. Maybe we don't want to go too fast.
Yeah, but I will say, Silas, that the why now is, really largely can be attributed to government policy shifting, or at least standards, targets and focus areas to national strategies shifting towards a low carbon economy, and then making available subsidies and the development of carbon markets coming into play and so on. So it could be a very positive thing. And that's where it's interesting to see how it would shape once they start to regulate the industry more. Right now, it's not really.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to see, because I do admit, there has to be a world where there has to be some sort of regulation in these areas. I just hope that it's done well, right? Which is always the hard part. But I think, good, smart people are working on it. So I'd be keen. You mentioned kind of before we started talking here, before the show, a bit about talent, right? So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the talent market and what it's been like to find talent, because I'm assuming, largely speaking, a lot of the roles you're filling are very technical in nature. What are you finding, and where are you finding people from, since this is a newer space?
So to answer that, I want to actually tell you a story. So last week I was in Germany at the Hanover Messe conference. It's quite a large conference that happens in Hanover, Germany every year. And it's been happening since the Second World War. So it's one of the largest kind of industrial conferences out there. There are 13 major halls of exhibitors and decision makers, technical talent, marketing, just a whole slew of people that actually attend this conference. I went around 3 different halls, talked to different exhibitors, and asked them one question: what's your biggest challenge right now? The 3 halls I went to visit are the hydrogen and fuel cell hall. So this is, of course, what we're talking about, the nascent sort of technologies. It's a new market and so on and so forth. Secondly is the automation hall. And thirdly is electrical. So things as simple as developing cables and wires and transformers and so on. Components for electrical systems, basically. And without fail, every single person I asked said talent. So I realized we're not alone. It is extremely difficult to find the right type of talent. And I think it's twofold. First is university programs do not offer the sort of skills training required for what we're doing and what a lot of companies are doing. And secondly, there is a huge competitive landscape when it comes to talent acquisition. And there are a lot of companies that have very, very healthy compensation packages so that they can be competitive in this market. But that said, there are companies that we've talked to that have had those compensation packages, that have had to, compete with 3 or 4 other companies that have had even better compensation packages. And so that's definitely an issue. In terms of how we hire, who we hire, we're mainly, because we know that you're not going to graduate from university or go through your career with a set of skills that would make you extremely successful just off the ground with getting up to speed with, what we're doing or what the industry is essentially working on. We look for people who are intrinsically motivated to grow. They just want to grow, they want to learn, and usually it's people who love that sort of experience of, I want more and more and more responsibility so that I can grow bigger and bigger and better. And so we look a lot for character. Of course, there's a level of skill of skill that we're looking for as well, if you're on the technical team or if you're doing partnerships and so on. But it really is the character that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. And for anybody who wants to get into, I know you mentioned some universities, or probably many, don't have programs on this technology, right? Because usually universities will catch up to trends a couple of years later. What are the engineering degrees, if we're talking kind of on the technical side, that people should pursue if they wanted to be in a space like this, like the clean hydrogen, or maybe the enablement of that? What are some of those? What would you recommend for engineering degrees there?
I mean, from a technical perspective, electrical engineering, chemical engineering, and if you're lucky enough that your university offers electrochemical engineering or electrochemical science, that would be the best sort of degree for, working on the technical side of green hydrogen. There are also universities I've seen that offer degrees in battery engineering or battery science. That's electrochemical in nature, and that a lot of those learnings can be translated to any other type of electrochemical system. Yeah, and then applied mathematics is a good one as well, in terms of being able to essentially understand the controls theory side of things. Yeah, systems engineering for some universities, but it wasn't available in my university, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to see how I mean, I have mixed feelings about university in general. I think that with engineering, it's kind of a required thing for people to receive those skill sets, but I oftentimes think that, and maybe we'll see this happening. This is a idea that's kind of been floated to me through one of the other podcasts I listened to, which is governments using their scholarship monies, right, when they're deciding whether or not to issue government loans for colleges, to decide which industries do we need to grow and which talent pools do we need to grow, and only offer loans for those to encourage, right? Because it's kind of like, maybe the CEO of the company, right? They're looking and seeing what areas do we need to grow, and they're addressing funds to those areas. So I'd be keen to see if that is happening, or will happen at some point in the near future, where you start to take it away from other areas. Again, there could be a risk there, but perhaps it's more useful for us as an economy. Do you know if Canada is doing anything like that?
No, I don't know. I wouldn't know, but I think there are a lot of degrees and skills that are overlooked. People always look at, technical or startups or a technical startup, and they think engineering, computer science, and so on and so forth. But some of the most difficult skills that really move the needle in a company are skills like communication skills, writing skills, being able to actually understand complex concepts and be able to simplify them. Because a lot of technical people get really into the weeds of things. And so we need people that are able to actually develop systems within any organization and develop these processes and then make it work.
Yeah, I always find that fascinating working with engineers, is that oftentimes the most sought after engineers are the ones who can take something complex and they understand their industry well, but they can take a complex thing and then translate it into non-engineering terms for commercial people and for other things like that. So that's what I do find that fascinating that you mentioned that. I guess maybe there's a couple last things maybe to wrap things up here. I'd be really keen to understand what is the in the past and currently what has and what is the fundraising process looking like for a company like yourself that is doing something physical that's very difficult and deep technology. Kind of could you walk us through that process, some of the areas you guys look for funding, maybe throughout the different stages and the evolution of it?
Yes. So one thing to note is the HACS program that we actually went through, they were our first funders. So they actually invest a pre-seed amount in the companies that go through the program. And so to start out, it's a very long due diligence process, but it's one of those things where the appeal or the value proposition that they offer is we will help you iterate really fast and we will give you some pre-seed financing. But as we were going through and developing the company, two things that we really wanted to make sure that we achieved. First off is we're going to develop this company to be a sustainable company, and sustainable not in the sense of environmentally sustainable, though that is of course a target, but that it would be a company that will create an impact for generations to come. And so for that, we knew we needed to be patient. We need to always make decisions for the long term. And so as a result, the three key things we wanted to do was, first, we need to de-risk our technology scale up. Second is we need to de-risk our market value. What value do we offer the market? And C, to whom do we offer that value? And so we spent the past 14 months really focused on these three things. We've been able to get our technology to a point where it's mature, demonstrate it on client sites, sign contracts, develop partnerships. And now we understand what the landscape looks like, essentially. But to get here, one thing that we really leveraged is support from the Canadian government. So that is actually something that, you know, you'd mentioned the government allocating some funds for topic areas, you know, to train people in topic areas that they care about. They're kind of doing that with focus areas that they want Canada to be leaders in. And so there has been a lot of focus on clean technologies lately, and hardware is a main component of clean technologies. So we found a lot of support through being able to access some funding through government organizations that make available funding for technologies that they see has created an impact. But to get from 0 to 1 to the point where you can actually leverage those funds, it was a bootstrapping process for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's always the difficulty, because I think there's something that you mentioned that's quite impactful. I think is interesting, maybe worth restating, is your idea of building the company in a sustainable way that looks at long-term impact, right? And I'm curious, you know, you mentioned just now having to kind of really struggle hard and bootstrap through to get to the funding stage for the government to be able to receive some government funds. How during this kind of, I guess you could call it survival phase, right, where it's like we really need to do things right in order to stay afloat here, how do you maintain that long-term outlook to do things properly when there are like short-term needs that you need to do and you might have to make, I don't know, concessions maybe? Could you kind of walk us through how you guys stuck to this long-term vision during that time as well?
Yeah, so first off, we were lucky. So, you know, right off the bat, because when we were starting this process and pivoting away from water treatment, that's when policies started to come out, targets started to come out for developing a low carbon economy. And so what that meant was that there would be a market pull if we could find where that market was. And we weren't looking because we didn't know where to look. We didn't know what we didn't know at the time. But one thing that we did and we consistently do is we have a very short feedback loop. And so every single assumption that we have, we will go out and validate it by talking to a lot of people. And we'll do it in a way where we'll test if essentially something is valuable enough by asking someone to quantify the value of what you're offering. That's a very high level kind of, idea of how we've approached things, but we made sure that the feedback loop was just extremely short. And we didn't build until we validated exactly what we would be building.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. So it's kind of following this idea of really proving, I guess, the need, if you will, and the market, so that you knew once you did go for it, you'd have the traction to be able to continue building. Correct?
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Awesome. Very good. Well, I guess maybe we've talked about a lot of great things. I think I don't know if there's too much else to go over. I'd be keen to just hear your general thoughts on what you think the future is for the space. Kind of broadly, I'm assuming it's positive given that you work in it. But kind of your thoughts on what the future might look like over the next 5 to 10 years and what people can do to get involved.
I mean, I would love for someone to tell me what the future would look like in five to 10 years, because that would be really interesting. I've heard I'm just going to tell you what I've heard. I've heard a lot of people saying there was Clean Tech 1.0, which was the early 2000s, and that didn't end up being sustainable and so on and so forth. But the way I see it is that Clean Tech 1.0 has essentially introduced the idea and the efforts for us to get to Clean Tech 2.0. But where the shift is really happening here is that the whole world is coming together every single year. The UN hosts its annual conference. Countries, so 32 or 34 countries have national strategies around electrifying manufacturing. There are mandates for developing low carbon transportation. And so if we think, okay, governments can move slowly, if that's kind of the assumption that we're starting out with, then imagine making that decision to actually publish some of these targets or come together around this idea. Imagine how long that may have taken, maybe. And so, I would hope that even if it's not Clean Tech 2.0, that it's Clean Tech 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and there are many, many different iterations as we learn, and that we just continue to collaborate in terms of countries, governments, labs, R&D, academia, companies, towards that.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I feel as though, again, this is just thinking about history because I wasn't necessarily around for these things per se. But if you look at a lot of the evolutions of different technologies, how maybe people were kind of poking fun at it, right? The internet, right? The tech bubble, officially, those issues that popped up initially because people poured into it and then it burst but people realized it's sticking around, right? And then eventually you have kind of this entire movement. So I would assume that something similar would happen with clean tech. I think obviously it's interesting to see how a lot of people poured into it in 2008. I personally am a bit concerned that there will be another kind of deflation of the bubble because I think that the difficulty of building climate tech startups is unknown to many people, right? So there's going to be many losers over the next maybe deflationary period of companies exiting. But I think that the number of winners, instead of just having kind of Tesla, for example, as one of the major winners from Clean Tech 1.0, we'll probably have a lot more major winners, right? And I think that'll be, I would hope personally that after this go around, we'll probably have everybody having learned enough, and then also realizing the dilemma that we're facing with climate change is real, right? And then everybody will kind of pile together and get on the wagon and do it in a smart fashion rather than just kind of dumping gasoline on the fire, if you will. But anyways, this has been really great to have this conversation. I'm very fascinated by what you guys are doing. I think to me, one of the most fascinating things is you've been able to pair a technology that is directly required for the energy transition with something that is also required for existing industries that you can also sell into. So that gives you kind of staying power regardless of they call it in renewables the solar coaster, but I don't know what they would call it in hydrogen. But I think it's very fascinating what you guys have done, and I really appreciate taking the time to come on, and we'll have to see you next time.
Yeah, thank you, Silas, so much. This was a great conversation.
Absolutely. Really, really appreciate you coming. All right. Thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode. Please let us know what you thought of the show. You can drop me comments on Twitter or in the comments on the social posts. Please also share this with somebody who might find it interesting, or perhaps somebody who actually knows folks who are in this kind of space who could really benefit from this technology. Generally speaking, the entire goal is, again, to spread awareness of these technologies, as many people are unaware of them. So please reach out to Maryam, of course, on LinkedIn to learn more about Pulsenics. And if you are joining us for the first time, please do, of course, subscribe and turn on notifications so you can be made aware of future content kind of in this vein. We really do appreciate any ratings as well, as it really helps us to kind of boost and bolster our listenership. If you are interested in becoming a sponsor or want to collaborate in some way through a partnership or something of that nature, please consider reaching out. My email can be found in the description. And if you are looking to get more involved, you can consider joining the Slack channel and following our LinkedIn page to more easily interact with other folks in the climate tech community. And then, of course, a quick shout out to our next episode. We will be speaking with Sean Murphy, who is the CEO of Ping Things. In technical terms, it is the world's fastest nanosecond precise time series analysis and AI platform. So in English, that means they have a platform that can help identify irregularities in massive data sets very, very quickly. And they are currently working mostly with utilities and other companies that kind of analyze data from the power grid to help solve different issues and identify problems in the grid. Generally speaking, it's a very fascinating conversation. I was quite honestly expecting this to be very dry and difficult to understand, but Sean did a very good job of boiling down very technical, complex data and information and make it kind of understandable and digestible for a non-technical person such as myself. So I'm assuming you're going to enjoy that as well. Really, really interesting conversation with Sean. And so again, thank you guys so much for tuning in today's episode, and we will see you next time on CleanTechies the Podcast.